name is Kay Schmerber. I've lived here at Rose Villa since 2014. When I first moved here, I lived in my father's apartment after he died because our parents were here. And that was while they were building phase 1. And then I moved into the Pocket neighborhood. Shall we begin? Okay. Did you know your DNA contains 3 billion genetic building blocks that make you who you are? And did you know that no more than 1% of you is uniquely you? 99% is identical to every other human being on Earth. Thanks to Marilyn and Steve, I've come to see the Rose Villa Today show as a chance to learn about the 1% in our neighbors that makes them entirely original. I first interviewed Gail in March of 2018 in order to introduce her as one of our Great Decisions film moderators. Mostly, I was curious about this very interesting woman I met in yoga class. I'll open today by sharing a few details from that earlier interview. You'll begin to see some of the 1% that makes Gail so unique. She was born in Indianapolis, grew up in Chicago, and attended universities in Iowa and Wisconsin. This is how she described what happened next. I spent my first quarter century in the Midwest, then left in a fit of boredom with all my belongings in a '68 Chevy and drove to California. She landed in San Francisco in 1970 and moved to Kensington in 2003, where she remained until arriving at Rose Villa in 2017. Gail is a web interface designer and has held various IT positions, including 20 years at Genentech in San Francisco. Asked what she prefers to read, she said, anything science-tinged. Her favorite technology is her digital camera. I enjoy photography as a practice for its own sake, she said. Gail has traveled all over Western Europe and Southeast Asia. She's driven across the United States more times than she can count. When asked what one place she would most like to return to, she replied without hesitation, Siena, Italy, to see the paleo horse races. She recalled that a fun day 20 or 30 years ago would have involved skydiving, which she's done a couple times. And a day of fun now, I asked? A hike in a beautiful location on a warm day, then pigging out with a friend in a magnificent restaurant with some Willamette Valley wine. Remember those days? Asked when she was last surprised, she replied, when I woke up one day and realized I really was at Rose Villa. I'll be darned, I actually did it. And asked what was something she wished for, she said, I wish for contentment, a safe and happy landing. I feel very safe here. 2 years have passed since Gail graciously answered those questions about her life before Rose Villa. And here we are today, at the very edge of multiple endings and beginnings in our individual and collective lives. Our topic for today's interview is Gail's experience as a volunteer at the Zen Hospice Center in San Francisco. Perhaps her stories and insights will illuminate our common humanity. So Gail, tell us about the Zen Hospice Center and how you became an end-of-life volunteer caregiver.
Thank you, Kay. Zen Hospice was founded in the 1980s in San Francisco by a bunch of volunteers who were trying to alleviate some of the suffering associated with the AIDS pandemic, another pandemic, that was really affecting San Francisco to a great degree. Many people were dying. Many of those people were dying on the streets. So that's where the volunteers chose to step in. Their efforts eventually evolved into a nonprofit organization which occupied a lovely Victorian house and was the place where there were 6 residential beds where people could spend time at the end of their lives. This house, the Victorian, became known as the guest house, and it was staffed by a group of nurses and social workers and other caregivers. Many volunteers were also there to support the services at the guest house.
Okay. You know how sometimes you feel like you're at the end of a long rope, and at the other end sometimes there's a tug? Was there a tug that drew you to death and dying?
There was a tug of sorts. I had just retired in 2012, and I was casting about for perhaps someplace useful where I could volunteer. I don't actually remember how the tug from the Zen Hospice came to me, because I have had no background in Zen. I wasn't a Buddhist, and fortunately, you don't have to be a Buddhist to volunteer there, and you don't have to be a Zen practitioner or anything to end your life there. So I honestly can't recall how the tug arrived, but I'm surely glad that the tug came at that time in the right direction for me.
Okay, thank you. You said in an earlier conversation that training doesn't stop when you start. Can you tell us something about your training experience and what it was like to start?
Yes, certainly. I recall the very first day of our training, which was quite a lengthy training, 2 weeks for about 60 hours, I think. The first training, we were each asked to write a letter, to compose a letter to someone we knew who had died. And then we were each asked to stand up and read our letter aloud to the rest of the volunteers in the group. This was a searing experience, and it very quickly brought together as a community of friends, people who had arrived just that morning as total strangers. The training was an introduction to really the more meaningful training, I would say, was after the formal classroom was over, and we actually began our service to people at the hospice. So we learned that there is a great diversity of dying, that it's a very individual process. There's no standard formula. Some people express themselves with hostility and anger. As a volunteer, you have to learn not to take it personally when people curse at you. Some people are just very withdrawn, and they would turn their faces to the wall in the bed and not want to interact at all. And we had to be okay with that as their preference. It wasn't all doom and gloom, that's to be sure. There was a lot of frivolity and laughter, a lot of listening. We learned to be good listeners, and sometimes just good sitters. You just not talking at all, or not listening to someone tell their life story. Some people like to tell their life stories, and they like to tell it to you over and over again. Much of the time, we just sat in silence and maybe held somebody's hand. So I guess I went into the volunteer program thinking that I would better prepare myself by sort of educating myself about what the dying process is like. And mostly I learned there's no pattern. It's a very individual thing. And you just cannot know what to expect.
I know that sometimes when you're the hospice volunteer, you're involved with the families of the dying.
Yes.
What was it like to, you told me about one experience where you were role-playing.
Yes, that's right. One of the things that we learned in training was that some of the most difficult interactions are not with the person in the bed, they're with members of the family. We were each assigned to role play a part. My hapless fellow volunteer who played the role of a volunteer had to deal with me. My task was to be a patient's estranged wife who really didn't feel a lot of compassion for her husband and was kind of waiting around, to collect the insurance. I was told afterwards, "Gee, Gail, you were really mean." But it is a good thing to have some previous practice, because sometimes the most difficult interactions are with family members, especially when they don't agree on the course of action or the type of support to offer to their dying loved one who isn't always loved.
When you close your eyes and recall the days and nights at the center, what sensations, what are you seeing and hearing, or touching and smelling?
I think, ironically, it's not the times when I was actively doing something. We were often, it's not very dramatic. I mean, we're just sitting with someone by their bedside and maybe holding their hand. Some people were good at giving foot massages. I was not, so I basically just sat with people. And as I mentioned, much of the time was spent in silence. And that kind of goes against the grain for many of us, including me, because I sort of always felt like I needed to fix something. I needed to be helping actively. I needed to be doing something. And often there really was nothing to do except to be a friend and just to be a supportive presence and to be content with that.
I know there's some stories about the guest house.
Oh, there's a lot of stories.
I'm smiling because I remember one in particular. But share.
One of the things that happens to people as they are living the dying process is that they could begin to lose the swallow reflex and they have difficulty chewing food. That was the situation affecting one man who, however, really, really wanted a hot dog. He craved a hot dog. And we talked it over, with the cook, and we thought, gee, do you think he can handle it? And so the cook got a Frankfurter and spun it around in the food processor with a little bit of mayo into sort of like a pate. And then she shaped it into a cylinder and put a little squiggle of mustard on the top. And we fed it to this man, and he really liked it. So that was very gratifying. But it brings to mind another food-oriented story where I showed up for my shift, and I was told, Gail, could you feed lunch to to Arthur there. And so his meal, beautifully prepared, were a couple of delicate crepes filled with strawberry preserves. And so, being the good little volunteer, I carefully cut up the crepe into little squares, slowly fed it to him one bite at a time, watching to make sure that he finished the first square before I fed him the second one. So this went on for a while, and then I noticed he was glaring at me. And then he said, "Watch this." And he picked up the remaining whole crepe and jammed it in his mouth. And it was as if to say, while strawberry jam was dribbling down his cheeks, forget the kid glove treatment. I'm not dead yet. And so we have to learn to modulate our responses, to be aware, of how people are behaving or acting, because every situation is different. I'll share one more story, which happened one morning when my co-volunteer, there's usually 2 volunteers per shift, she couldn't be there that morning, so I was alone on the floor with the nurses, and it was a really busy morning, kind of hectic. We had an admission, and that usually takes extra work to help somebody get oriented and settled. And there was just kind of a lot of rushing around. So I burst into one man's room, a little distracted and out of breath, and I said, "Hey, Luca, are you ready for lunch now?" And he just looked at me and he said, "What is the best thing that's happened to you today?" And it just stopped me cold. Like, here is this guy with a brain tumor asking me to slow down and be more thoughtful. And I just thought, wow, the best thing that's happened to me today is that I'm here with you, and we can just sit and enjoy the morning together. And that really taught me a lesson, so that I tried to remember going forward that before I go into someone's room, to just stop at the threshold, take a breath, and before I go in, because you don't know what you're going to encounter. Every situation is different. Every person has their own style. Every person has their own way to traverse the last days of their life. And we just need to respect that and to set aside all of our turmoil of what's going on for us that day, or worry about how heavy is the traffic going to be for me trying to get home after my shift, or what will I have for dinner tonight? Where am I going to get the groceries? That kind of thing. And so Luca, the man with the brain tumor, was a good teacher for me.
One thing that I've been curious about in volunteering for this kind of work is the idea of a shift. I guess my fantasy of it was that you went in and you saw the same person every time until they died, and then you got a new person. But when you were talking earlier with me, you described shift changes, and how when you arrived at a certain time of day and for your shift, and you didn't know what to expect. But what I was intrigued by was when you said the shift changes had their own personality and what happened with you and the rest of the staff.
Typically, there were 2 volunteers per shift. There was the morning shift, afternoon shift, and the evening shift. But the shifts overlapped in time by 1 hour. So there would be 4 of us in the house during shift change, and we would have an hour together, and we would spend that time, just the 4 of us, talking. We usually start off with about 15-minute meditation, and then we would talk. And as you can imagine, much of the conversation was about people who were in the house at that time, how so-and-so was doing, you know, what to watch out for from somebody's obsessive son or daughter, you know, things like that to help us to support the people in the beds. But sometimes we would just read poetry or tell stories. So it was, it turned out that was a way to really build community and friendships, which I still maintain to this day. I still keep in touch with a lot of the people at the guest house, both volunteers and staff, nurses, and so forth. They're all just super wonderful people, and will always be a part of my life, I'm sure.
I dreamed up this question because it came from my own experience of sitting at deathbeds. After the person died, I always had 1,000 questions I wish I'd asked. So I was wondering, is there a question, or more than one maybe, that when someone is going through this passage, if they are conscious, that you wish you would have asked, or that you would have liked to have known?
Yes, I would say I wish I had asked, what are you thinking about right now? And as I recall, I did actually ask that question to one young woman, and I waited for her, you know, deep, profound answer when I asked her, what are you thinking about right now? And she said, a smoothie.
What has this experience, how has this experience, and in what ways has it been integrated into your daily life?
There's these things, these called the precepts. Precept is a sort of unusual word, but I take it to mean something like guidelines. They're not really like commandments or anything. But the guest house had its own set of precepts, and I still rely on them to try to remind me how to live my life every day here at Rose Villa. I can read them to you. There's only 4 of them. Mm-hmm. First, welcome everything, push away nothing. Second, bring your whole self to the experience. Third, don't wait. Fourth, find a place of rest in the middle of things.
I almost want you to read them again, please. Would you?
Okay. Welcome everything, push away nothing. Bring your whole self to the experience. Don't wait. Find a place of rest in the middle of things.
Thank you. Well, I guess in some ways you may have answered this question In what ways did this experience as a volunteer change your relationship to death and even to your own death?
Well, by volunteering, in the first place, I thought that I would come to understand death and dying, and thus be better able to face my own death. However, what the experience brings to mind is actually a story that I heard, where a junior monk in a Buddhist temple approached his master and asked, "Master, how should I die?" And the master suddenly had been seated on his cushion, and he suddenly fell off the cushion and clutched his stomach and began rolling around on the floor, groaning in agony. And then he suddenly just stopped and got back on his cushion and straightened out his robes and resumed his previous state of poise and equanimity. And I'm still not quite sure what to make of that story, but one of the takeaways for me is that I'm not going to be in control of how I die. And no matter how much I may intend to have a, quote, good death, a serene and peaceful death, that when the time actually comes, I have no clue about how I'm going to respond or what it will be like. And I just have to accept that, like push away nothing, and just be grateful for the wonderful life that I live, and just be ready for anything.
Well, that's the end of my questions.
No, I get to ask one, don't I?
Okay.
I get to ask one. So you briefly referred there to your own end-of-life experience,
Mm-hmm.
and could you tell us something about that?
My own end of life.
Well, not you.
I have
Not
not
yet,
had a
not
near-death
yet.
experience yet.
Yes, but you have had experience with
Yes.
being in proximity to somebody who is dying, right? Yeah. Tell us about
Well,
that.
thank you for the question. There were several deaths in my immediate life and family. My mother died, and about 4 years later, my very good friend and sister-in-law died of pancreatic cancer, and I was at her bedside. I had been at my mother's here at Rose Villa. And a year later, my husband died of pancreatic cancer, and I was at his bedside. And a year after that, my father died. He fell here at Rose Villa, and he died at OHSU, but I was with him when he died. So it's been a compacted experience of sitting at bedsides. After my husband died, I wrote a poem. It's very short, and I think it summarizes what those experiences taught me about death. I'll share it with you if I can find it here. It's called Precious Matter. What is precious perishes. Take nothing for granted. Not the breeze, nor honey, nor the sparkle in another's eyes, nor moonlight. Nothing is ever destroyed. Even exploding suns are transformed. According to the law of thermodynamics, nothing is lost forever, not one particle. Some seeds cannot germinate without the intensity of heat caused by catastrophic fire, they say. In the anguished, empty stillness, after someone seems extinguished, there remains energy and light. We live between borrowed eternities. Nothing lasts, nothing is lost.
Thank you, Kay. Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anything that you, closing comment or something that you would like to say to the listeners before we close?
Yes, I would like to just point out, with thanks to Steve, that there are a few links on the website leading to Roseville Today, which point to information that is related to our interview today. If you would like to check those out, they're available for you. Hope you enjoy them. Thank you.
Thank you.